folks can start out by writing down in our chat today where you're calling in from, and also if you like to do any kind of field work. Field work can mean anything from habitat restoration to gardening to monitoring different species, to doing firework, and any other examples you can think of that I haven't thought of. So I would love to hear anybody's field work that they're up to. Ooh, fabulous. I'm seeing working on our own land with native plants. That's fabulous, Debbie. Cool. Ooh, working in an old farmland with a lot of milkweed. Yes. Fan club. Restoring an old pasture. Fabulous. This is wonderful. Yeah, please keep adding them in. It's wonderful to hear. So as a little bit of background, my name is Ivea Moore, and I do field work in the field of habitat restoration out in a place very close to where I live called the Presidio. And I will share more about that as we go on. But the reason why I'm holding this workshop is because sometimes we might realize that when we're out doing field work, it's a little bit difficult to do nature journaling at the same time. Something about having tools in one hand and having a nature journal in the other. Yeah, a little complicated. So I'm offering this workshop as a way to hopefully add in a few ideas about how to balance the two and make it a little bit easier. But I also want to encourage you all that if you have any ideas of your own, please enter them into the chat. And also at the end, I will encourage people to share if you have ideas or techniques that have worked for you. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we'll begin our presentation. Let's see here. Any questions to start with before we officially begin? No? Okay. In that case, officially welcome to Nature Journal in one hand and Matic in the other, and how we nature journal our field work. So, as I already asked people to do, I asked, what sort of work do you do outside? And I saw that people had some really great comments on it. Restoring native plants, working on their own land. Yep. Monitoring, gardening, transforming bare pastures. It's wonderful. And here are some of the work that I do. This is me out here at my restoration site in the Presidio of San Francisco. And I do habitat restoration. So this is my site, priority 1 that I like to work at. Now, this is what it actually looks like as well. So the Presidio, this area that I mentioned, is here in San Francisco. I live in San Francisco, and on the upper northwestern corner is this little national park. Now, because it's in the city, it has kind of a unique situation. It's part of what we call the Golden Gate National Parks. And that has a few different sites in it. So there are some areas up here. It's also called the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. There are some more sites down here. They're not the same as a city park, like Golden Gate Park. It's different because it is managed by the National Park Service and some other associated organizations. So this is where I am. I'm in the Presidio of San Francisco. Now, you might be wondering, what is habitat restoration? Some folks might already know, but just to go over it, the idea behind habitat restoration is repairing and renewing habitats that have been degraded or destroyed based on human activities. And sometimes that can be historic causes, sometimes it can be present day ones. And the reason why this is important, many reasons why, is because the more habitat we destroy, the fewer plants and animals there are because they don't have their spaces to live. San Francisco specifically has a sad and infamous history of this. Pardon the traffic. There used to be a butterfly living here called the Xerces blue. How many folks have heard of Xerces blue? A few of us. Yeah, the Xerces blue was this gorgeous little butterfly that lived in the sand dunes of San Francisco until about the 1940s, where it was last seen. And at this point, parts of it had been developed, parts of San Francisco had been developed into a military base, and other parts of it had been developed into housing. So the Xerces has a host plant called, or had a host plant called deerweed. And because of the way that the habitat was disrupted, it couldn't find enough deerweed to continue living here. So it's gone now. And it's the first butterfly in North America that has been documented going extinct as a result of human activity. So that's a sad legacy that we live with. And so that's why we restore, is in hopes that there won't be other creatures going out the same way as the Xerces butterfly. It's important for biodiversity to have a lot of species because it improves ecosystem health and resilience. It's sort of like having a table. If you have a table with only 2 legs or 2 species, then if anything happens to one of the legs, be it disease or rot or anything else, then the table does not stand. But if you have a table that has lots of legs on it, lots of different species with their different resiliences and their different healths and their different niches, then you have a lot more stability in the habitat as a whole. And that's why biodiversity is so important. Now, it's not always possible to return habitat to a so-called pristine state. When you look at the sort of untamed wilderness, that's not always possible. Plus, most of the wilderness wasn't as tamed as we thought. So a lot of times, like here in San Francisco, we have to do a compromise between the habitat that the plants and animals need, and then also human history, and also sometimes special interests. And so our goal is to compromise as best as we can for everybody, but especially for the animals and the nature, and to have long-term goals of managing this area. So there we go. It is, as I say, a lot of work, and it's also a lot of fun. This is a picture I took back in 2002. I was 16 at the time, and this is a pile of ice plant that a group of about 30 of us pulled up. And yes, that is the Golden Gate Bridge in the background. And it was on some very steep bluffs. If you were to walk this way, you'd fall. So you have to be very careful when you're crawling on the bluffs. So this one, I want you all to participate. You can unmute yourselves and call out if you'd like to. Why should we nature journal our field work?
To record the progress.
To record the progress? Yes.
To help you pay more attention.
Definitely.
Also to see the effects of what we have done so that we can adapt if need be.
Yep, that's a big one. If we make a change in the environment and it goes a way that we don't like, then we have to know what we did, and then we can change our methods. So that's a good reason. Are there other reasons?
Maybe to share with others and inspire others to join in. Yes,
to inspire other people. Oh, I like what Jasmine is saying here about inspiring ourselves, so that we can, so that way we can motivate ourselves to continue it. That's a huge reason. Sometimes you might find yourself going home and looking at your nature journal and falling in love with the field all over again. And then that you're inspired to return again and again to that field to make it even better. Yep, keeping a record of what works, what doesn't. Any other ideas? These are wonderful. So I think we covered a lot of reasons I like. So as we were saying, if we're working in the environment, then we are changing that environment. And it's important to keep track of those changes. Since we're always nature journaling about how nature changes, we're part of that too. So we want to record our processes. By documenting our work, we make it possible for others to follow. So it's important to be able to give instructions or ideas left behind for people, so that if somebody comes along our site or our area and doesn't know what to do, they can see what we tried. And then they can say, oh, maybe let's do that. Also, as we talked about as well, process modification, so that we can find more efficient ways of doing our work or notice things that we might have missed. Also, because it opens up our thinking, because we think of things that we might not have ordinarily thought of. I know that that's a huge one. Like, questions lead to more questions, lead to more observations, as we all know, the curiosity chain. And then, as Jasmine mentioned as well, self-validation, because our work's important. So those are just a few reasons. Now, it's important when you're going out into the field to consider your logistics. Because as I mentioned before, it's kind of difficult sometimes to balance. So it's always good to consider, how much gear are you carrying, especially if you have like back problems or any sort of physical challenges. it's important to be really, really mindful of your body and just how much you can carry, and then slim down as much as you can on whatever you're carrying with you. It's good to consider how accessible your journal is when you're in the field. On the one hand, you want it in an area that you can easily grab if you need it. But on the other hand, you don't want it to be in the way of when you're trying to do your work. So I know that a lot of times in our Nature Journal Club, we're encouraged to use side bags to carry our journals. And so that way we can easily grab it. But if you're trying to carry a side bag while you're leaning over with your tools, it might get in your way. So then maybe you have a backpack on, maybe that's a bit of a scramble. So then maybe you have to wait for a more convenient period to get it out. I oftentimes will leave it haphazardly kind of in my purse because it's easy to open. Also, is there a place to comfortably journal, or is it likely that you're going to be standing? If you're in an environment that's either very, very rocky and uneven and you can't really get good footing, then you might not be able to sit down. Or if you're surrounded by rare plants, you definitely can't sit down. So it's good to consider that. Consider exactly where in the field you're going to be able to hold your nature journal. And for me, the biggest consideration is how much time do we have to do our nature journaling versus doing our field work? Because usually if we're out there doing field work, that's the priority instead of the nature journaling. But I don't think that that means that nature journaling is necessarily a bad thing or a distraction. I think it is a wonderful enhancement to the process. So just some things to consider. Are there any questions so far before I continue? No? Okay, we'll continue. So, as I just said, pack light. It's good to pack light because you're going to be carrying two different kinds of toolkits. You're going to be carrying your field gear to do the actual field work with, and your nature journaling kit. So, for example, I drew kind of an inventory here because I was having trouble keeping track of everything. And I might go through here at some point and even look and see how much of this do I actually need. Do I need my gathering bag for the stuff that I weed? Not really anymore, because I happen to have a dump site right there. So maybe I don't need it because there's a dump pile. Do I really need both my hand lens and my binoculars? Maybe. Depends, I guess, on what season I'm in and what plants I'm looking at, or maybe I don't. So it's always good to constantly go back and reassess what you do and don't need and pare down. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. It just means that we're adapting. I mean, it's not even, it could be because our styles change over time. It could also just be because seasonally we need different things. So I think it's a really healthy practice to constantly go through and prune your kit if you need to, so-called, and add things. So here's a question that I'd like to hear from you about. How long do you usually spend in an average nature journaling session without field work, just like in general, when you're going out to look? And there's no wrong answers. I just want to know what people, 30 minutes to about 2 hours. Cool. An hour to 30 minutes to an hour. 1 to 2 hours. Cool. It's kind of neat knowing like what everybody's styles are and preferences. So variable 2 hours to 4 hours. Yep. I tend to be more variable myself. Sometimes it can be as little as 5 minutes and as long as 4 hours. Yep, I'm the same way as Debbie. I do a lot too after I come back in. So cool. It's kind of good to see like how everybody's different preferences and everybody's different time lengths. So when that comes in with field work, is, as you can imagine, maybe we don't have as much time as maybe our normal sessions. And sometimes that can take adjusting too. I remember when I started out doing my restoration diaries, at first I had this impression that I had to do something very polished and professional looking, something that looks like this. This is okay and informative, but I would consider this to be kind of a pretty picture in a way, because I was focused on my art pieces, and there's nothing wrong with that. I know we talk about it's not about the pretty picture, and maybe it's not, but sometimes we just get genuine joy out of making them, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. So there's nothing wrong with that. The thing is, though, to consider is that how long does a pretty picture take to make? And that might not be time that we have right in the field. And that's okay too. Again, that's not dissing the pretty picture. It just means that maybe we don't have the time right then and there, or maybe we do, who knows? So before I go on, and I know some of you have seen my workshop before, so maybe don't answer this, but for those who haven't, please take a guess. How long do you think it took me to make this page? Or you can guess if you don't remember the answer. Okay, Anne is guessing 4 hours. Debbie guesses 3. Any other guesses? Heather's guessing 2 hours. A week, an hour. This is exciting. Okay, here, I'll continue now. Oh, an hour and a half. Miriam is guessing 1.5. Katie agrees. Here we go. So before I answer that, my suggestion is kind of to mix it up. So that means that sometimes it's okay to take a while on a drawing. Maybe you take an idea home with you and take a while. So most of this, if not all of this, was done at home. I took notes in the field on a separate page and then came home and did this. So it's okay. And I also took pictures. So it's okay to go home and take things, take things home and take longer. And it's also a good idea, though, to get in the habit of doing the quicker pictures and notes in the field. If you save it all for home, then sometimes the information won't be as fresh. And plus, I think it's just a really, really good habit to get into doing things right then and there, because it starts the process and it makes it easier to continue it once you get home. You can do both. I think that there's like a time and a place for each, and it's up to you to figure out what balance works the best. And to answer your question about how long this took, it took me a month to make this page. This was back when I didn't have as near strong confidence in my art skills. So it took me a very long time and a lot of nail biting to make this page. I could not have done this in the field at the time. So now we consider, what are the most important things to write down if you're doing a field journal? And I want to also add, you might not agree with what I'm saying, and that's fine. Really, ultimately, it's about whatever works best for you in this. It's about whatever you find to be the most important. I'm going to share my ideas with you just so that I can give you kind of a starting point on what I think, but you don't have to follow this if it doesn't work for you. So I personally find some of the most important things to write down are, first, the metadata, which is the date, the time, the place, and the weather. Some people go really, really deep into the metadata. I don't necessarily have the time or the tools to do that. So I figure date, time, place, and weather is good enough. If it's the sort of location where I go the same time each time, maybe I don't write that down one day, it's fine. But at least if I have these basics, that's pretty good. I always try to write down what my objectives or my goals were, because then that way we're keeping track of our tasks. And then a lot of times I'll also write down who the main species was I worked with, because that kind of detail is good. So on this particular day, it was the bird gerbil that I worked with the most. So I made sure I wrote that down. I wrote down that my goal was to take out as much of it as I possibly could. I wrote down a couple of other notes. I mentioned the season that I was in, and then the work done. What do we do today? And one of my doctors says that she calls it making a ta-da list instead of a to-do list. So I wrote down that the result was that we got, 2 bags of invasive plants and a bunch more, and it was about 80%. So I was very proud. I got 80% of the bird gerbil offsite that day. And even if I'd written down nothing else, that would have helped, because that's something I can track. And then after you get those basics down, then you can tackle the never-ending source of observations, which are the wildlife notes. Anything flora, fauna, inorganic factors, anything interesting, anything weird. But as long as you get those basics down, or at least as long as I do, I'm trying to remind myself that that's enough. I don't have to be hard on myself if I can't do more than that. Like this day, I meant to do a landscape ito. I had this big idea in mind of doing a landscape ito. This page was going to be amazing. And then this is all I got to draw. At first I was disappointed with myself, but then I looked back and I thought, hey, guess what? That's still information. That's okay. Oh, before I go on, are there any questions so far? No? Okay. And then here are some general tips that I offer before we get into the tools, which are the more specific ones. The key is to capture information in whatever ways are the most efficient for you, not for anybody else but you. You don't have to be like whoever. You don't have to be like whatever famous nature journalers. You don't have to be perfect. Just be efficient for you and what matters to you. Only you know what's most important. Another one is to be flexible in your approach and do what works best. That can be important if we have a method that works for us for a while, but then something changes, it's okay to change with it. It's okay to change with the field and to try something new and struggle with it even. Another one is to use whatever you have on hand, even if it's just a notebook and a pencil. Now, I'm curious, raise your hand. Has anybody ever decided to not journal because they like didn't have their paints, or like, you know, you look in your bag and like, oh, I forgot my paints. There's no point in journaling, and you know, you kind of give up. Anybody ever experienced that before? No? Some of us? Maybe, yeah, some of us. I definitely have. And then later on, I was like, well, yep, okay, so good. I'm not the only one. So yeah, you know, we might feel like that, but it's okay. But like, it's good to get into the habit of just, even if you only have a pencil, just start it, and it's okay to do that. A big key for me has been learning how to make my sketches small, because they're faster to draw that way. I can't count the number of times I tried to begin a big sketch so I could catch all of the details, only for the animal to move or only for me to run out of time to do it. So if you can do just small, quick sketches, it makes it a lot faster and a lot easier. Another thing is to know that you probably won't be able to capture everything on your journal page that day, and that's okay. Do what you can. And the good thing about getting to go back, especially if you're going back to the same place, is that a lot of times you'll remember something just by going to the same place again. It'll jog your memory, and the field will still be waiting for you. So you can write down those changes, or you can write them down next year or next week. So don't worry if you can't capture everything. And my bonus tip is to create a symbol, a simple set of symbols maybe, to help you skim your pages faster for information. So for example, I created this symbol in my garden journal a while ago, and I would put every page that was in the spring, I'd put this in the upper corner, so that way, if I needed to look throughout my seasons and be like, oh, what happened last spring, instead of slogging through these pages that at the time didn't have enough drawings in them, I would just simply look for the symbol and be like, oh, okay, so last spring this was happening, and it makes it a lot easier to skim. So it's just something I might recommend as well. And let's see. Oh yeah, I like this. Heather is saying sometimes she doesn't journal. She just wants to experience the moment. That's good too. I think there's nothing wrong with not journaling sometimes and just experiencing and enjoying that moment. As for how many journals I keep, at the moment, I keep 4 for different purposes. One is my main journal. It's actually this one. I don't know if you can see it, but that's okay. It's recently begun. I named it Virgo. My friend Jasmine inspired me which one to name it. And this is the one that I keep for all of my notes with Jack and for any fun adventures I go on with nature journaling crews, and that kind of thing. I keep my restoration diary, and I keep only one for that. That is my little frontier monoceros. And I deliberately keep a small journal, because then that way it's easier to fill up a page. Because if I'm doing field work, I already know that my entries are not going to be as long as they would on my big journal. So I use my little journal, and then I can finish faster with the pages. The dopamine slosh is great, and you know, then I'm happy, and it's easier to carry around. I keep another small journal for this particular community garden that I do my work in. So that way, if anybody from the community garden wants to see my notes, I can just hand over the whole journal and not worry about them seeing other stuff. And last but not least, I have a special one for me and my son, because I'm trying to do activities with him. And so I want him and I to be able to personalize that as being ours. So those are my 4. There were other times though where I kept only 1, other times I kept 3 because I was trying different styles. Yeah, whatever works best. If anybody wants to, I'd be curious to see if people want to write in the chat how many journals they keep too. And I'll continue. Oh, Heather says she keeps 1. So the first of our tools are maps. Maps. Why are our maps important? Well, one reason could be to define your work area. After all, where are we? What's the area we decided to do our work in? I think it's good to be able to do that. So for example, on my map over here, this is a map of my restoration site, and there's a bunch of little miniature areas within them. My original map, I had drawn the roads and the parking lot and everything else. I mean, I guess I still kept Lincoln Boulevard in here, but so many lines can be a bit confusing. So I grade in the areas that I work in, specifically those, so then I could see them. And then I named them different things. So then that way, if anybody happens to come along my journal later, they'll know exactly where I worked or what I was responsible for. So defining your work areas is one. Another one is to observe and show where you are and what your surroundings are like. So with this one, with priority one, which is over here, I decided to be specific about what kinds of different shrubs were around. And this particular one, I wanted to note the proximity of where we were working to the bike path. And also that there was a slope here so that you could see that there's like this little tucked up area in here underneath all of these trees where we were working on the bright green stuff next to a bike path and just up from a really steep slope. And I wanted to note that so that that way people would know kind of how precarious it was that day. Another one is to document any changes that you make to the landscape. I don't really show it here, but in my garden journals, for instance, I like to draw or I like to label exactly what's in each bed. And then in a different season, I'll draw the beds again and write down what the next thing was that I put in there. And that can help so that that way, if there are certain plants that shouldn't be planted in succession, then you have your map to look back on and say, oh, the tomatoes were here, don't plant them here again, or else they might get tomato mosaic virus or a different one of those viruses. So that's why it can be important to have maps. Another one is to plan future work better by seeing the whole picture. So here I might say, oh, I noticed that I'll just say, I freed up this Baccharis or this coyote brush here. I freed up the ceanothus, but I noticed that this one's kind of getting overrun by the Cape ivy. I should free up this one next. Or I noticed this entire area back here needs to be cleaned out. So I think that can be important. So that way you have a better idea of your field. Another one is to compare maps and to see changes over time. So sometime I might go back and redraw priority one and see if there's any new shrubs up here, and also to see like how much we might have. I should have probably gone through and noted down all of the areas with the Cape ivy, but I don't think I had time that day. So I'm going to be nice to myself and say it's all right. Also, it can help to make maps that show movement. So if there had been a visitor bird in here, I could have said, okay, I saw this mystery bird land in this particular Baccharis, and then it flew over here, and then it fought with another bird over here in the soil, and then it flew over here, and then I heard it cheeping around here, so I think maybe its nest is here. So that can help. You can have arrows showing how things move. And also to note clues in the landscape about its history. So with here, I can look at this and I know that these are where the stairs are, but I might be able to later on go back and question, why are the stairs here? Is there a certain kind of rock here? And how does that affect the plants that grow here in the natural history? And then noting that on the other side of this are soils that we cannot touch. Why can we work in the soils over here versus over here where they're super contaminated? Why? So that kind of thing can be helpful when you have a map to look at. Our next tool, which I know all of us nature journalists already know about, are landscape ethos. So that can be important because it helps you to recognize elements that you didn't recognize before. So for example, in my mind, before I tried to draw this, because for me, drawing this helps it come alive, is that I could already picture this ceanothus in my mind's eye. I could already picture the brush pile in here, but then I didn't quite know what to make of the gap in here, like what was going on. And by drawing it, I realized the ceanothus was a lot bigger than I always pictured. It had all of the branches over here. And that was challenging because we had Cape ivy crawling up into the ceanothus. And so that gives me an idea that, oh, this is work we're going to have to do someday. Also, I don't think any of you have visited my site with me yet, but I invite any of you to walk it with me at some point. But even though you haven't, just by seeing my drawing, it gives you a little idea of what it's like. In a way, it's saying, hey, everybody, meet my site, meet one of my favorite places in the world, from my heart to yours. So another reason why I love doing landscape ethos. Gives me a better feel for it. I can see like the sort of profile and be thinking, would this be called coastal scrub? Probably because of the presence of the ceanothus and the coyote brush and the toyon. And also when I'm at home, I can picture my work better because I can visualize it by looking at my landscape ethos. So things we might have already thought of. So here we go. Our next tool would be words and our numbers. I'm a big fan of using describing words on things. So one thing is that you don't need to write in complete sentences. I think Melinda says that this is not an English class, or maybe it's Brian, I don't remember. Somebody very wisely says that this is not an English class. So you don't have to write in complete sentences. You know, observations, nondescript brown stems running laterally through duff. Perfectly good image, didn't need a proper opener. You can see if there's any common themes, and then you can create a routine or a layout for that info. So for example, my pages were pretty disorganized at first and I didn't know quite the order. And then that's when I figured out to write down the goals and at the time my technique of how I was taking things out, and then also my aim, because I would look at my pages and sift through all of the different stuff I'd written and think, oh, is there a theme here that I can do? Or in this case, this is for one of my house plants. I could say, oh, are there certain numbers I want to keep track of? I wrote down on a scratch piece of paper, and then I was able to group them all together so that way I could chunk the information in a way that made it easier to find. You can use headings. Ray Bonto last time advised me that maybe I do a box around some of the things that they stand out, and I'm probably going to start doing that as soon as I figure out ink that won't run, but I'll figure out a way. One thing I love to do, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen my nightmare of a supplies bag and can attest to this, is that I like to use 2 to 3 different pens with different colors of ink, because then instead of just, you can see, like, you can sort of read here because of the headings, but it's also one big wall of text in a way, compared to down here where it's different colors. Makes it a little bit easier to look, so that then you can say, okay, this is the stuff that's labeling this landscape etho here in the green. My goal's written in this color. And then my kind of long-winded observations are written in the much lighter blue. So I think that it helps to break up the page, for me at least. You can use boxes to separate your text. I'm going to do that sometime. You can make lists. I'm a big fan of lists. Oh, and then did anybody have any questions before I go on? No? We're okay? Alrighty. So, oh, sorry. Here's a tool, and this one is added from my last time I did this presentation, are big question marks, because I didn't recognize I was doing this. I'm sure we've seen Fiona and Jack and other people do this kind of thing, but I'm a huge fan. I love going on my page and writing down huge question marks and highlighting them, because then I can remember to go back here and say, okay, this is a question I wanted answered. And when I'm scanning my big page, like when I'm scanning my pages or like a lot of pages, it's easy to find them suddenly because they stick out. I like that it reinforces my practice of asking these questions, because I get kind of this little thrill in having, you know, a whole bunch of these throughout my journal. It's like having freckles or peppers or just something that's like an extra little spice that I love. I just think it's wonderful. And then it also makes it easier for me to go back and like do follow-up, either research or thought on this. So I highly recommend, if this is appealing to people, I highly recommend adding this to your journal, just for funsies. And then another tool is the inventory or the field collection. And this one can be good because you can focus on one thing, especially if you're getting super duper overloaded with all of the stuff in the field. So I remember going out, looking at plants, trying to think about how to do percent coverages and numbers, but then there's like a whole bunch of different species and I'd get overwhelmed and my brain would try to do like a crash. And then I thought, well, what if I just simply looked at one question? Who is flowering today? And then draw those. And then instead of doing tally marks or whatever, I could just get kind of a glimpse of what it looked like that day. This is a continuation of a different entry. So the date is over here on the other page. But then that way it's easy for me to look back and say, whatever season this was, oh, this is who was around and flowering during the season, who was there that day. And then that way I can go, like, maybe next time, you know, this time next year, I can say, oh, who was flowering and has that changed at all? And why would that be? And so it's a good way of keeping a record. And in this case, I wanted to keep track of some plants that were crowding out the manzanitas that I take care of. And in this case, the plants were still pretty small because it was at the beginning of spring. And so I like to keep track of the seedlings if possible, because then in future I can yank those out if I can identify them correctly, instead of waiting for the plants to get huge and unmanageable. So those are just a few examples of inventory and field collection. One of the drawbacks, though, is that even something that looks like it should be super duper easy, depending on, I don't know, however we are as artists, for me, this took a super duper long time to do. Time that I wound up having to stay after work to finish, and then I had to go home to color this all in. So I found an easier way, and that is the wildlife inventory checklist. And that one can help. You can write down all of your species that you see flowering today, and I transcribed everything that had been on that page, and then I checked off all of them. And then the next time I went into the field, in this case, I decided to go ahead and use different color of inks that I'd remember it was a different time I'd gone out there. I could add more to the list and then check them off, and so on and so forth. So it can be either daily or ongoing. I prefer ongoing, and it's kind of like a roll call sheet. You can either check off a species as present, like I did here, or you can do a tally of how many members were present that day. I myself am not so great at counting once it gets above a certain number. I need to do more practice. Like, I know how to count to estimate like flocks of birds, but when we're in the field, I'm not so good at it, especially if I have a huge area to cover. So I maybe need to find a more efficient way of doing that. But that's okay. Or maybe if like I have a very, very small number of individuals. And it's also a great way to save time, as I mentioned, because then you only have to write down the name once, but then the next time I didn't have to write down this name again. I only had to write down anything new. And then again, and then I have 4 more times that I can go and do my inventory here, and I won't have to write down any of these names, only what's new. So it saves me a ton of time. So here is another tool, one of my favorites. This is rubbing or printmaking or tracing. And I got some of my inspiration from a class with Melinda Nakagawa on this, one of our Sundays. And this can be really helpful if you have really annoying plants that don't very much like to be drawn. And I know some of you have heard me rant about this particular plant. This one, poison hemlock. Looks a little bit like lace, doesn't it? It's what we call multipinnately compound leaves. Not bipinnate, no, not tripinnate. I count quadrupinnate on some of these, and it is a pain to draw. And I kind of like the challenge, but when we're in the field, I maybe don't have the time. So on this particular day, I'd taken off a piece of it and I painted on it, and then I pressed it to the piece of paper. Oh, sorry. Did somebody say something? Did anybody have a question? No? Okay, that's okay. So here, like I'd originally taken off a piece and then I painted it with the paint. This is what Melinda taught us to do. I painted the leaf and then I pressed it onto the paper. And some days it works really well and you can get a really clear print, as you'll see later on in my presentation. But on this particular day, I didn't, for whatever reason. Maybe the weather, maybe the leaf was off, maybe I mixed the paint wrong. So I decided to do something different. I put the leaf down and I painted around it using dark paint. And then I took it away and it left behind a negative shape of the leaf. And then that way I was able to see, you know, or at least I was able to convey to folks, this is sort of what this leaf is like. All of these little, all of these little leaflets. And sometimes that can really help you if you have a leaf that's complicated to draw and you don't have enough time. So let's see here. We have diagrams. Now, I rave about this lady, and I'm sure that some of you who went to Wild Wanderer might already have seen her presentation, but if anybody gets a chance to check out Amy Schlesser's Doodling Diagrams workshop, I highly recommend it. And if you aren't doing the Wild Wanderer pass, that's okay, because Amy did the presentation previously and Jack has it on his website. So you can get some of her wonderful information, but I highly recommend. Diagramming is a really, really cool way of not only presenting information, but labeling information. So diagrams can show information, processes, and or help you figure out things. So like, let's see here and here, I was trying to label as much of this bird as possible because I'm not the strongest birder yet. I needed to learn more. And so I wanted to draw as many notes as I could since I couldn't quite draw it quickly enough because it hops. And I'm hoping that my notes will eventually help me figure things out about who that is. Diagrams can also help you to be specific when you're describing something. So I could have just, written damaged leaves and new buds somewhere down here, but I mean, and people can figure out the damaged leaf, but actually labeling which parts were the buds can help somebody who maybe doesn't know plants. Or it could be, when I'm talking about this one particular bioswale, then this is what the bioswale looked like, especially the area with the rushes, which is very riparian of it. It can help highlight something that catches your attention. I happened to see these two grasses and I got the feeling that they weren't the same species, even though they were very similar. And later on, as I was going through them and labeling why I thought they were different, then finally I got the final piece, which is where I was looking at the ligules and they were different. And I got confirmation that they were in fact different species, but I would have wanted to make notes of this so I could remind myself what told me that they were different again. Oh yeah, that's right. It was the ligule. So that's significant to me. It can be a great way to capture movement. I didn't draw it here, but I recommend that if you're doing especially like animals, or if you're seeing a certain way a plant moves, or if you're watching the way maybe a plant pops open suddenly. Great thing to do if you're watching evening primroses. They're also a great way to easily combine words, pictures, and numbers. One of my favorite things to do when I do a drawing that maybe doesn't look the best is to add lots and lots of notes, and then it becomes informative. And then people don't notice the so-called not so great drawings. It doesn't matter to me as long as it's helpful. Oh, thank you, Heather. Heather posted up the doodling diagrams workshop from Amy in the chat. So thank you for that. And let's see here. And also any drawing can be turned into a diagram. Yep. And another tool, I don't know how much, like sometime I would like Jack to do a workshop about this because for me, it's one of my favorite tools that he's ever taught us are these Y webs. And you might notice while you're doing field work, you have mysteries in your head and you wonder about them. Sometimes this can be really helpful because then you'll pay attention to different parts of the environment that could answer the question. But the Y web is to take one of those mysteries that you're noticing out in the field and then come up with as many different ideas as possible about why that is. I forgot to add also that there should be a line here saying another question mark, which means there could be other reasons. But you can always add more reasons as time is going on. So in this case, I was wondering, what was causing these manzanitas to suffer? Because as you can see, they have diseases on their leaves, and I wanted to know what was wrong with them. So I wondered, maybe it's not enough airflow, maybe there's resource competition. And then after that, I thought, well, what kinds of resource competition? Let me be specific. And so I tried out for, could it be weeds or could it be fellow native plants? Because that didn't even occur to me. So that was kind of cool. And then, what kind and how do I tell about the diseases? Because I did not take integrated pest management in college, and now I'm, sort of kicking myself over that. But it's good for me to know so that way someday I can follow up on this. Probably I should have added a really huge question mark because this is the kind of thing I really want to follow up on. But it also helps you to expand your thinking and to problem solve. So it will help you broaden your observations, at least I think. So another tool is cartooning. Now I admit I haven't used this in my restoration work as much, but I would like to, especially with some of the tools like the weed wrench. But it can help you draw a sequence of either events or thoughts that have happened. So if an animal does something, or if, maybe you've seen a tree that got blown by the wind, it fell down, and then something, then it got hauled off and it left this huge divot, and then something grew in it, or you never know. In this particular case, I drew my idea of what I thought would be an interesting way of making seeds grow in the garden, because I've noticed that a lot of species prefer disturbed soil. So I thought, are there any garden species that prefer that too? And so I thought if I just simply pulled up the weeds and then made sure that the seeds from a different plant, like maybe lettuce, is kind of sprinkled in here, then would that help them grow better than trying to grow them all neat and tidy in a pot? Because sometimes certain things like it more when you don't care. I know that like thyme plants, for example, can't handle too much love, or else they get unhappy. And I want to use the other reason too about a step-by-step for how you did a particular task. So that way I can include instructions someday about how you position the weed wrench and then how you lever it. Just so that if anybody ever comes along and doesn't know how to use it, they will see my instructions. So somebody else can follow in your steps, like I said. And also, if you're like me, I don't have a greatest memory as I used to have anymore. I forget things and it's kind of frustrating. So it can help you to see how you did it. You can remember how you did it later. And also, you can also analyze your process and coming up with a way of doing it easier or more efficiently. Or if you made a mistake, then you can by writing down exactly what you did, you can go through step by step and say, oh, this is where I messed up. So that can help. And as always, because we want to document exactly how we altered the field that we are in. Does anybody have any questions so far before I continue? Any questions? No? Okay. And let's see here. Oh, wait, is my page showing something weird? Let's try that again. Okay, there we go, photos. This is another tool I like. And I know that this is a tool that a lot of times kind of gets, I don't know, not nearly as much acknowledgement in the nature journaling community. And I think it's because it's not, definitely not because photos are bad, they're not, but I think it's because we want to make sure that we don't become overly reliant on photos when we also want to be doing field notes. But the thing is that photos also have their place. And my good friend Heather we've had some really, really good conversations about this too. So I am convinced that also photos have a really, really good place for this. You can use it to document things so that you have more than one way of showing it. So that if people look at your drawing, but you also want to show a picture, you can convey different information on each of them. With the picture, you're showing something exactly the way that it looks on a screen, or through your lens of your camera, which is pretty close to what our eyes are. And then with our drawings, we can show extra information that maybe the picture cannot capture, with our arrows or observations, or we can use arrows to point at, oh, this is significant, look at this. Photos can help you to go back to observe something more closely, especially if you don't have a lot of time while you're doing your work in the field. And if you're like me and you're doing work in a national park, then you don't have the option of taking specimens home. You definitely cannot take any native plants or even rocks home from a national park, or feathers. So the only thing you can do is take a picture or draw it. And also it can help you jog your memory about observations that you might have had. I also, as I mentioned before, and I should have put that here too, I also will take pictures of things that I don't have time to draw, and then later on draw from the photos. And yeah, they say that maybe that's not as great as drawing it in the field, but honestly, I think it can be fine. It's not, if nothing else, it's practice. As long as you're drawing something, it's practice, even if it's from a photo. And so I think that photos definitely have their place. And yeah, I encourage folks to talk about that more. Heather and I have had some really good conversations, and I think that that's definitely something worth talking about. Some extra tips that I have are that if you're planning to draw from the photo, like that particular spread of the plants that were crowding out my field inventory and collection, that one I had to do a lot from photos because I didn't have time to do so many fine details. So what helps is to take pictures of the specimen in question, this particular one, from a lot of different angles, because then you can add more details. So if I just taken it from this one, I might have been able to draw little bits of it in here. But when I went up close and looked at this, then I could see sort of the texture better of the seed pods and what the flower looked like better than I could have. I mean, maybe I could have zoomed in, but this helps me to remember to look. If you frame the photo in a certain way, you can use the photo to tell you where to look. And so I did that here. And again, here, when I wanted to pay attention to this leaf. And And again, here, when I wanted to pay attention to what the base looked like. And this is what I got in the end, this possible bitter cress, but I might not have gotten nearly as clear of a drawing if I hadn't taken the extra photos to remind me of the areas to focus on. Oh, I see that Joni does the same thing. Taking photos, especially if we see numerous things to journal, definitely. Oh, agreed. Heather makes a really, really good point about how it can really help to put on iNaturalist as well. And iNaturalist is a really good way of citizen science where we can share our observations with each other. We can document who is there, and almost anybody can take part in it. Plus, it's a really awesome community on there that collaborates. So I agree, highly recommend people try iNaturalist. Here's another tip that kind of ties into the photos, and that is to practice drawing difficult things at home. So the one that I wound up doing the leaf print of, this same one. And this was a drawing that I did of it earlier than that. So this is the infamous poison hemlock. And this is me on a particular day or a few days, as you can see, I put more than one note of which day it was, of trying to draw this one plant that is the Socrates bane of my existence. Poor Socrates. And trying to figure out the best way of drawing it. You know, do I do embossing? Do I just, you know, focus on a small little leaflet? Is there a way I can do the entire thing? Do I use, you know, a stick to do it with, like Marley had taught me? And I think he learned that from Laurie Cunningham. No, possibly Laurie Wigham. I can't remember. Do I do negative space? And taking a picture of it. In this particular case, I took a picture in grayscale so that way I wouldn't get overwhelmed by the color and I could sheerly focus on the texture of it. And then also I could add in, I'd know exactly where to add in the values to make it more, you know, hemlocky. And then another thing I enjoy doing is looking for other artists who have tackled the same difficult subject. So in this case, I used the Jepson's manual to see how they drew these multipinnately compound headache leaves, because it can be good to imitate. Other times I've used children's books to draw certain habitats. For example, drawing an understory for me is really challenging because how do you draw it when there's trees everywhere and then there are, you know, vines going up the trees? And so I used one of my favorite artists, book illustrator Jerry Pinkney's book, Minty, about Harriet Tubman, to look and see how he handled drawing the woods from the understory perspective. And so it can be really helpful to look for other artists and practice that at home. So that way it gets easier in the field. So definitely practice drawing things at home. Another tip that I have for you is voice recordings. And I'm going to play a recording in a second. I couldn't figure out how to get it here onto Google. But I like this because sometimes I'll have rushing thoughts and I won't be able to get it out fast enough, especially if I'm trying to do the field work first and the nature journaling later. So it can help to have a voice recorder. And if you happen to have a smartphone, I'm not sure about Android, but if you have a smartphone from Apple, then there is a built-in feature where you can record things. And that's what I do. I use that. And you can say it out a lot faster. And then also you can listen later and it can help you jog your memory about what to write in your journal. So here's an example. I'm going to play sort of some example of my field notes. Here we go.
The vista, west-facing patch, but in the sunlight, not beneath the trees. The white ground sparrows are seriously going off this morning. Also, I was sent over here to weed up the mellolotus, but it is a total for the AC party over here. I see mellolotus, the sweet clover. That's what I have to pull out. I also saw burr clover, which is the Medicago polymorpha. I saw the one, the vetch, the vicia, probably Vicia sativa, and my absolute favorite, just saw deerweed, formerly known as Lotus scoparius, but now I can't remember the new name. Botanists. It's so beautiful. I've been looking for this earlier. I remember that the Xerces used to like this plant. Rest in peace, Xerces. Now I'm wondering about the mellolotus and the deerweed. I wonder, when butterflies go after the deerweed, does the mellolotus confuse them if it grows too thickly where the deerweed is? Is that why it's so imperative I pull this out? Also, I wonder if it's taking up space from the deerweed. I always think about the little plants that, oh, big deal, they're there. You know, the big ones don't. then it's not going to take over the site. That's what I think about things like oxalis. But then I wonder, is it because it outcompetes space for the littler plants that grow closer to the ground? I need to write this down later.
And so that was just kind of stream of consciousness, but a lot of notes that might be able to help me later on as I'm writing down. And I did wind up making a journal entry that covered a bunch of those different things. Wound up giving me a lot to think about when I was at home, giving myself homework, and then also keeping the field with me a little bit. Plus, one of the things that I just realized is that by having a recording, you might get ambient noises. So I know that in my recording, I mentioned the white-crowned sparrows, but it helps me to actually hear them again too, because it reminds me of that day. Like I can picture where I was standing now because of the ambient noises. So that can help. And also if you're speaking out loud, then it's sort of like meta awareness. You become a little bit more aware of the sorts of things that you should probably note down that people can't see, that they can only see because you're talking about it. So those are some other ideas that I would have. Another one, this is a new one that I've added, but I love, is field strategy. And this one is pretty much like task listing. Really, that's what it is. But it's about trying to figure out which tasks to do in what order, especially if you have a lot of tasks to do. It can help because you're writing this in the same nature journal where you've already had all of your notes in the past about the field. So you can go back and reread your notes as references. It can help you have all of your considerations there. And you can always, of course, change things around. It could help you to diagram, like you could even make little icons next to it. Just writing it down will help you to think more about it. And so strategy can always be helpful. Sort of the same way that we were talking about just nature journaling in general being helpful, but this is a lot more explicitly strategizing what you want to do with your field work. So I recommend that. Another one is that it is okay to start an entry in the field and then finish it later on at home. There's nothing wrong with doing that. We can't get everything done in the field, and again, that's just fine. My recommendations would be to start with what is hardest to record or to remember in the field, because then that way you get that down so that it's not going to slip your mind later. Or sometimes that can relate to nature journaling languages. So if you have trouble with numbers, but you happen to notice certain numbers in the field, jot those down. Or if you're good with words, in my particular case, I tend to feel like I'm better with words than I am with pictures, then you prioritize doing your drawings in the field. So instead of going home to draw this, I drew this right then in the field, and then I could remember my thoughts. And so then later on, I could add what my thoughts had been. Although I was careful too to not overdo it, it's important to make sure that whatever your information you're adding is accurate and not conjecture, which can be hard to do because our memories do change. So that's why I think it's important to start the entry in the field. Even if you don't get to finish it till you get home, that's totally fine. And so you can see here, I did the prints in the field because I had access to the materials. I wanted to do a comparison between the birch wool and the poison hemlock. And I didn't write this down because I knew the difference by looking, but I wanted to make sure I wrote that again. So, oh, sorry, okay, here we go. Another one, and this one can be for fun, is to add yourself into your journal. That way, when you're reading again, or if somebody else is reading again, it's almost like having a narrator. I mean, it is having a narrator, it's your journal, but it also, I don't know, it kind of makes it a story. It makes it entertaining to follow. You're able to insert your own thoughts into there if you're not sure where else they go. You can make yourself laugh, which I think is a huge one because laughter is so healthy. There's a whole study of laughter called gelotology. I recommend people enjoy gelotology. In fact, I'm just going to write that in the chat right now just for funsies. Ooh, and I like what Miriam is saying too about biometrics, about using your body for some measurement estimates. That's a really good point, Miriam. So to do that, I suppose I could have drawn that it was a bit more above my head, but that's a really good point. Like adding your journal in there to say, oh, you know, I stood right here, but that maybe the Cape Ivy was up to my ankle or something like that. You can even do a dash line to say, oh, this is where that was. Miriam makes a really, really good point about the biometrics. And so I highly recommend, especially because we ourselves are in that ecosystem. And so drawing ourselves out there doing it reminds us, I think, at least it reminds me, that we're out there making an impact on the ecosystem, and reminds me to, in my particular case, it reminds me to watch where I step. I drew my big clunky boots in here, and so I have to be more mindful of where I step in the field. But yeah, it just helps to think about that. Like I said, it also can make you laugh. This particular day, I'd forgotten my Picmatic at home, and so I was kind of sad. So it reminded me to not do that again. Another one, and I think this might be my last tool for today, but it's one of my ultimate favorites, is making a group journal. Now, I haven't gotten to do this in the restoration field yet, just because I haven't met any other nature journalers out there yet, although I'm hoping to maybe someday encourage my my supervisors to join me. So Michael, John, if you're watching, I'm going to convert you someday, my friends. I'm just kidding, only if they want to. But I did this at a garden one time, back at the Chrissy Field Center. Oh, yes, I can enable live transcription if you would like. So one of the things I did at this garden was there were a ton of different species, and I know it would have been really difficult for me to have written all of them, all of the observations about them all the time, because there were so many of them. But the biggest reason to do this, for me at least, was to increase everybody else's interest in this garden. So the staff joined in, and the staff began to have more of an investment because they made friends with these plants. And it's like what Jack says, that love is sustained, compassionate attention. So in this case, the more time that they spent with their plants, the more they began to love them. And so by having a group journal, you can collect more information if there are more people who are collecting it than you would by yourself. It's a big one. Another one thing that can help too is that because more than one person is taking in this information, people have their extra perspectives. They have their different perspectives. So maybe I'm good at taking in notes about certain plants, but then maybe Jack is with me, who's super duper attuned to the birds. Or then maybe we have Miriam, who's more attuned to, reading signs of fire in the landscape, and who might be able to talk more about like the water content in the ecosystem. All of those perspectives give so much better of a perspective, or a well-rounded picture when you're looking back on this. So if you have everybody writing in the same journal, all of these notes, then well, I personally think it's kind of magic. It can make everybody as a collective more observant. Ujima, meaning unity. No, wait, collective work and responsibility. I'm thinking Umoja, meaning unity. Yeah, Ujima, collective work and responsibility. And I personally think that having that kind of teamwork makes bonds a lot closer too. And I think it makes the team a lot closer because you're cheering each other on. Yep, deepening communication in your group. And it's fun. So these folks here who signed up, later on, they began to write down their observations about their plants. And now I have this one particular friend and mentor named Ernesto here. Ernesto, if you're watching, thank you. And he decided to watch after this oak tree that he had kind of helped to raise. Now, Ernesto, my friend here, used to tease me about being a tree hugger when I was a kid, because he wasn't nearly as into plants as I am. But Ernesto here wound up writing more entries about his oak tree than anybody else. And he even drew his oak tree later on. And let me just tell you, it was magical seeing how much he loved his oak, and like how motivated he was to come back and write about it. And I saw him a few weeks ago, after a long time, with the pandemic, not seeing each other. And he said that the entire time he was at home, the one thing he kept thinking about at our work was that oak tree. So I think that it's special to be able to have this all together. So here's my recap of all of these different tools. I'll let the list sit here for a second in case anybody wanted to write down these categories. Did anybody have any questions?
Ava, will you go back to your one on inventories? I just wanted to take a picture of it so it would remind me later.
Of course. Yeah, I'll go back right now. Hang on a second. Oh, my slides. I'm definitely going to be posting this video up on the internet. But if people would like my slides, I can share it with you or send it to you. I can find a way to send you a copy. Sorry, let me just try to inventory. Where was it?
Keep going. There.
Is it this one?
One more.
Oh,
Go,
this-
go one more. Yeah, but with all
Okay.
the little checklists.
Okay. With all the points you said? Or-
Yeah.
Okay. There we go.
Hold on one second. Okay, got it.
Cool. So yeah, I can make the slides available to people later. I would just recommend emailing me, and I can put my email in the chat in just a second if people would like my slides. And like I said, I'll also be posting this up on my YouTube as soon as, like, pretty soon. Here, my email. There we go. And so these are all of our tools. And I think of these as being more like techniques that you have in your tool belt. One more thing I recommend is to not try to use all of them at once. Because time's a consideration when you're out in the field, I recommend maybe using one of them each time you're out there. So that then that way you're not overwhelming yourself trying to do everything at once when you still have field work itself to do. So you might notice on some of my pages that maybe, not always, I mean, sometimes I go home and I can do more work, but maybe on certain pages I only did printmaking. Like that day that I had my my hemlock, or maybe on a certain day I only did the landscapeito. I didn't do a landscapeito and a map because that would have been too much time or work. Or the same thing with my field collection. So it's okay to use just one tool at a time. And also, if there's a tool that you don't like, that you don't use very much, that's okay. You don't have to use it. Just use the ones that you enjoy using the most or that work the best for you. And also, if anybody has any other tools, I would love to hear them. Let's share. I love it when we share tools. So I think, oh yeah, one last question. And this one, Heather was helping me to remember too, is how does a person get involved in habitat restoration? I recommend starting out as a volunteer because, I mean, I could be biased, that's how I started too. And that's because then they'll teach you the skills while you're working. Some organizations might ask you to already come with skills, but I think for the most part, they accept anybody entry level. As long as you're consistent, dedicated, and enjoy it, then they can teach you how to do things and you can ask questions. You might have to ask around. I got super duper lucky. Somebody had told me about it. I was 13 at the time, and somebody had told me about this Chrissy Field habitat restoration thing going on, this huge project that needed volunteers. It was 1999, and I joined in, and us volunteers were mostly planting plants around the marsh and in the sand dunes between the marsh and the bay. And after we got all of those in the ground, then we needed ongoing volunteers for doing weeding. And then from there, I wound up getting internships during the summertime where I could do inventorying work. And so it built on each other. Like slowly the skills kind of built the longer you go out. And so I recommend doing that. I got lucky. I got to volunteer with the National Park Service and also the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. But there's also Fish and Wildlife Service. I took a visit onto their site, and they were recommending to register on volunteer.gov as well. And then you can specify what you're interested in. There's your local chapter of the Audubon Society. I know that they have things. In a second, I'm going to have Anne talk about this if she wants to, but Point Blue Conservation Science, go Anne Chadwick. Huge round of applause for Anne, especially with what they're doing with the mountain meadows right now. So there are those. There's also the Nature Conservancy, and there's others too. And the best thing to do is to start where you live and ask around, and then ask others for help. And the good thing too is that because we're a big nature journaling community, we can probably help each other. There's also citizen science sites like Zooniverse, and then also iNaturalist, maybe just by looking around and seeing if there are projects listed there. So there's a lot of different ideas. And I like what Heather is saying too about restoring parts of your own land. I noticed earlier that people were talking about properties that they live on and their gardens or areas that they have just decided to adopt. Sometimes you don't even need an organization if it's an area that's not really, watched by anybody. You can just kind of just do your thing. So there's that. And I hope to see you all out there with me in the field sometime. And I'm really thankful that I got to see you and all here today with me. So I will stop my share, and I would love it if anybody would like to either share their own experiences or ask any questions at all. And officially thank you for being here with me. Let's see here. I tried to stop my share and now it's not doing it. Stop the share. Oof. Okay, well.
It stopped on my screen. I'm seeing a gallery view of everybody. So
excellent. Okay, in that
Good.
case, I'm gonna remove my
Yeah.
spotlight. In a second, I'm gonna go to gallery view. Okay, yeah, here we go. Thank you. And thank you for your patience with my technology stuff.
Great job, Ivea. That's so wonderful. So this is Anne, and my question for you is, who do you share your journal with?
That's a really good question.
And why? You know.
So I have way too much energy. So I share it with anybody who's like, oh, so what are you doing out there? And I'm like, wanna see? But then I have to tone it down and say it's okay if people don't look. So I share it with any friends. I try to sometimes show entries to my supervisors if they have time to look. So that way they can see my thinking, or like any other time I've gone through the Presidio. And recently I even showed it to a fellow volunteer because she hadn't been to my site in a while. And we were all hanging out down at Baker Beach doing some work out there. And so I showed it to her and she was like, that's really cool. So my answer is anybody who wants to see it, I show it to them. And why? Because I just want to share the magic with everybody and stuff.
Yeah, I was out in the botanical gardens the other day and people are walking by and looking at a few things, but there were these turtles on a rock right out in a kind of a lily pond. And I stopped to sketch them and sketch some other just sort of studies in color and texture and stuff. And people would stop and ask what I was doing, and I'd point out the turtles, and they were so grateful that I had pointed out the turtles to them. They were so excited. So it was kind of a nice way to share without butting into what they're doing or interrupting their conversations or anything. It was just sort of inviting them to be curious and then share what I was observing and ask them what they were into. So that was pretty fun.
That's awesome. I just love it that we get to share that experience with people. I think it's in our nature to share. And when we have the good experiences to share like that, we bring everybody closer as a community, just because we inspire each other to care about the community and to take part in those adventures with us. So I think that's very important. And I see that that Jasmine has a question about, once an area is restored, do we still continue to work on it, or we just let it be for the most part? I think that we might do ongoing monitoring of an area. So then that way, if an area needs a bit more work, then we can come back to it. But then, yeah, once the area is good, we leave it alone as much as we can. We just kind of keep an eye. So far, I'm trying to think if there are any areas that I concretely know about that don't seem to require much restoration, but it seems like most areas I know of require a bit of ongoing maintenance. Even Chrissy Field. Some of our ongoing tasks that we do are we go out there sometimes to pull out the oxalis, because that's the plant that never goes away. But we don't have to do any big weeding projects anymore. The other thing is that I remember one particular time we were going along the marsh to check out all of the trash that had been washing up. There'd been a ton of trash washing up. And so we were going out there to just kind of pick it up and keep it nice. So yeah, I'd say that we will sort of keep an eye on it. And I see that Miriam is saying that it depends on the fire regime too, and how to keep it sustainable. Oh, that is a really good question, Jasmine, about if somebody with physical limitations can help out. Now, I personally think that's an especially interesting question because I myself have some physical problems. And I think it will depend on the organization. Some organizations might have a requirement about being able to handle a certain amount of weight, and that will be kind of difficult. I am all for making more opportunities for people who might have physical limitations, so that way they might do different tasks that are a bit gentler on their bodies. I know for myself, sometimes I'll try to favor the tasks that allow me to sit down to do my work if I can, if possible, so that maybe I can just like kneel down and work on pulling out the Cape Ivy. Or it's important to also be able to say when you need a break. Luckily, I'm with a group that's fairly okay in understanding if you need a break. I think it helps that a lot of the volunteers are senior citizens where I work. And so the site stewards, they can move at their pace. And I think that as a result, you know, nobody's ever, the thing that I like is that my supervisors never forget that this is volunteer work. So they always say, hey, if you can't make it on a certain day, it's okay. We're not like sitting here like, going, oh, you must show up. We're thankful whenever you can because you're a volunteer. So I think it's important also to find an organization or at least a crew that is really respectful and supportive when we might have challenges. Miriam says, someone with limitations, but that can journal. Yeah, totally. Like almost like a scribe, but somebody who like is capturing everything. That would be a wonderful role for somebody to have, is that they could be the person who's capturing a lot of the things in the nature journal. I think that'd be a wonderful role. So I would actually welcome us talking about this more in a bigger conversation. I think that this is a really, really good question. Does my work include planting things? At the moment, my work doesn't, but my work does not at the moment include planting stuff, but there have been times in the past where it did. Let me try to think. Oh yeah, so a couple of years back, funnily enough this day, a couple of years back, and okay, wait, maybe I will spotlight after all. I started going back to Lobos Creek Valley. And on that particular day, I decided to go with the crew who was taking out all of the Cape Ivy, my old friend. And, but the thing is that there was a second group who had taken these plants that they had from the nursery and were planting them because they hadn't been able to get into the ground yet. And I know that our nursery is still really, really active. So there are definite sites that need a lot more nursery work. I don't tend to do as much of that because there's almost always Cape Ivy to be removed. But I do remember at one point we were planting ferns down in Lobos Creek Valley as well. A different part of Lobos Creek Valley, sort of like underneath these trees here. At some time we were planting ferns underneath those. And that was as recently as 2 years ago, even though this has been a restoration site for a couple of decades at least. So yeah, sometimes. That's a good question. Let's see here. Ooh, if we bring in multisensory exercises and activities, we could add, we could bring in other people with different limitations. Yeah, I love this idea, Miriam. Somebody with visual limitations could capture bird calls as part of inventory. That would be really, really good. Yeah, somebody who could do that. They could capture the bird calls, somebody who's got that kind of ear, or somebody else could like really try to describe the different, or somebody could look at sort of the differences. Somebody could just look at specifically one species and say, oh, why is the species growing so well in this pot, but not this pot? And then write down all of the questions, just using your observation skills. And so that could really help if somebody might have trouble with limitations. Or you could take a break from doing the physical work and then take a longer break, like doing the nature journaling part. You could switch up kind of the ratio of time that you spend doing certain things to help your back and your body. I think that's a really, really good idea. Are there any other questions or thoughts or experiences people wanted to share?
I have a comment. I thought a lot of the things that you talked about were also very applicable to, not all of us are doing restoration, but some of us are doing nature-oriented jobs or, volunteer or otherwise. And so this is a good reminder of we can do that kind of thing while still doing our jobs. So I'm an interpreter at the zoo, and that would still be very useful for me to keep notes about what plants I see, what's in bloom, what animals are out different times of day or different times of year.
Definitely, Heather. That is a really, really good point. because the work that you do is in nature, because it's that kind of work, then those are all like, be able to keep those kinds of inventories or looking out. I would love to be able to see your notes on the zoo. It would be so cool to just like glimpse inside of your mind and see what you notice. And Miriam does amazing work with her pyrosketchology. Go ahead, Miriam.
Oh, I was just going to mention, I have been really interested in trying to kind of have a really good list of the metadata that can interlink and support citizen science, or just a good restoration project or effort. If you kind of know what is really helpful to know, so you might know what to spend more time on. So having, you know, a little checklist of, this is the metadata that can support a lot of different things. And then also visuals, though, maybe working with more of the different organizations and groups on what visuals could really help you. So, you know, like the cool cyanometer where you're looking at the sky colors and looking at air quality. I know they have ways of measuring air quality. You know, could they use more journaling images that we could share, but just how we cross-pollinate between citizen science and that sort of thing, and our own journaling. I'm just really interested in that. So if people are ever wanting to talk or brainstorm, I'd love to be involved in that.
I would. I was typing in what you were saying, or some of the notes of what you were saying, so I could remember, because that would be a discussion I'd love to have with you. I would love to have that conversation. Like, I'm curious, what sorts of metadata do you recommend keeping track of?
I think it depends on what you're researching. I think almost always your temperature, your relative humidity, and your wind speed and direction influences vegetation conditions, phenology, and, you know, obviously insects and different things with animals. So I think really good information on that is always good, but I'm sure there's a ton of other stuff that would be helpful. Elevation, aspect, you know, which amount of sun that you're getting on that particular area. So I think the hardest is getting that microclimate weather that, you know, a lot of the weather station stuff, it doesn't always hit that exactly like your local conditions. So that's probably pretty important, but I'm sure there's a ton of other stuff.
I agree. I completely agree. There's a ton of those things that I've been trying to figure out how to get. Like, I've some people were telling me about light meters where you can measure the output of light, unlike the sunlight, because I've been wondering about that too. Oh, good to see you, Jasmine, and thank you so much. It was so good to see you here. And yeah, so I've been wondering about like light meters and how to do that, because then it'd be interesting to figure out how much light a community is getting, and then even to compare that over time. And then, but, you know, adding that to a measurement of precipitation, and then wondering if that could account for why certain plants are acting certain ways. Like, either if the plant's blooming twice over, or if the vegetation has become, you know, maybe like all of the different adaptations that we find out about as a way of a plant holding on to not only its water, but then also almost like sunblock for when the sun is too bright. I'd be curious to see if we notice more of those. So I would definitely be interested in looking at more of those tools with you. Did anybody else want to say anything else? I'm enjoying this.
I had another idea. So when your talk really got me thinking about what I could do while I'm volunteering at the zoo and other places. When I volunteer, I'm not going to have a whole lot of time. So I might have 2 minutes or 3 minutes. So the idea that I could bring my journal is not applicable. So that was kind of my mental mind block. And then as you were talking, I just got to thinking, you know, I could just take a single piece of paper and fold it over into 4 or make one of those little small journals. And then that could be an insert I just put into my journal.
That would be such a smart idea, because then it's something easy to carry around with you. But then, like you said, you just paste it in, and then you have all of them together after a while in one big book.
Mm-hmm.
So smart. That would totally work. And I think that it's also good, like what Heather was saying too, about only having 3 minutes. I think that can be a good activity for anybody, is to try to see how much can you journal in 3 minutes, and then how do you prioritize what to do in those 3 minutes. And then does the priority change based off of the day or based off of where you are? And then does the information gradually add on so that maybe the 3 minutes on the first day, you're writing down a little bit about, okay, this is the species that I'm around and here's what I'm observing. And the next time you're writing in, okay, I'm noticing this about their feeding habits. And so you just take piece at a piece at a piece with the little bit of time you have.
So then the tools also have to be equally just well thought out. So do you use a brush pen? Do you use maybe like 1 or 2 different colored markers? Or I have a pack of 12 colored pencils. I don't know what I'm going to take with me, but I know that's something I'm going to think about. What can I use that's only 2, that I can just keep in a pocket and pull out and write real quick until someone comes and asks me a question or whatnot.
Yep. And then like how maybe in that case, it's not practical to carry the watercolors, because I know that a lot of times we'll like try to hold onto our journal open so that it can dry proper. But if we don't have the time to make it dry, then maybe we don't know with the watercolors. Maybe instead, like maybe it's, you notice that there's a certain color in the habitat that shows up the most. So you carry a single Tombow to occasionally highlight. Or you use like the one pen and get really good at like making different hash marks so that you can add texture to your notes. Or like Heather was saying, you get a really small piece of paper, or maybe you get a super duper tiny journal that can fit into your pocket. I know that I've heard of people who take runs and have like little notebooks in their pockets that they take with them. I think my friend Leslie likes to do that. So the size of the journal can count too. Those are really good points. It looked like somebody else, but was somebody else going to say something too? I want to make sure I didn't miss anybody. No? Okay, well, in that case, I think that was it for our workshop today. And thank you so much for joining me today. It was just wonderful to hear from all of you. And again, I hope to see you all in the field, or I hope to hear about your adventures wherever you are and whatever you're getting up to. And if you have any tools like beyond and including the ones we've begun sharing here, just please, I want to know your tools. I want them. So thank you and big hugs. Have a good evening, everybody.